Earlier in the course, I showed you a quick demo of Code First workflow. But the example I used in that lecture was pretty simple. We had a model with a single class. In this lecture, I'm going to show you the Code First workflow one more time, but with a more complex domain. A domain with multiple classes and association between them. So I'm going to create the same model we had in the last section, the Pluto model. But before we get started, we need to install Entity Framework. So we go to Package Manager Console. Now, before proceeding any further, let me give you a tip here. Since we're going to use Package Manager Console a lot in this section, it's going to be tedious to open it up via the Tools menu. So I'm going to show you how to create a shortcut so you don't have to use your mouse. Let's go to Tools, Options, under Keyboard. Here, you can type the name of commands that you would like to create a shortcut for. So let's type Package Manager Console. There you go. So all in one word without any space. Note that currently I have a shortcut here, which is Alt with slash and then dot. Since slash and dot are next to each other, I find this shortcut very easy to work with. So to create this shortcut, simply put the cursor here, press shortcut keys, and then click Assign and OK. All right, back to Package Manager Console. Now we need to install Entity Framework. Now, when you run this command, Package Manager will get the latest version of Entity Framework. At the time of me recording this, the latest version is 6.1.3. But we're expecting version 7 to be released over the next 6 months. I have heard that version 7 might have some breaking changes. So for the purpose of this section, I want to make sure you use the same version as me, and when Entity Framework 7 is released, I will create a new section in the course to keep you updated. So, minus version, colon, 6.1.3. Okay, beautiful. Now let's clean this up. Okay, now that the Entity Framework is installed, let's go and create our Pluto model. Okay, we have 4 types here: course, author, tag, and course level, which is an enumeration. Let's take a closer look at each of these types here. So the course class has a few properties like ID, title, description, level, full price, author, which is a navigation property to the author type, and tags. So a course can have multiple tags. Let's take a look at the author type. So the author type has an ID, name, and a list of courses. So as you see, we have a one-to-many relationship between authors and courses. An author can have many courses, but each course is created by only one author. Of course, this is purely an assumption here, and in a real-world scenario, we can have a many-to-many relationship between authors and courses. But for this lecture, it doesn't matter, because as you will see in a second, we have a many-to-many relationship between courses and tags. So let's take a look at the tag class. So here we have an ID, name, and a list of courses. So a tag can be applied to many courses, and a course can have multiple tags. And this is our many-to-many relationship. And finally, let's take a look at the course level enumeration. So the same enumeration we had in the last section. Okay, so here's our model. Next, we need to create a DB context. Remember DB context? It's a simple abstraction over the database that hides all the complexity around working with connections, commands, reading data, transactions, and so on. So let me quickly create a DB context here. So I'm going to call it Pluto context, which derives from DB context. And note that DB context is in system.data.entity. So because I'm using ReSharper here, it automatically added the namespace on top of the file as I was typing the name of the class. If you don't have ReSharper, you need to manually resolve that. Okay, now what goes inside a DB context? Here we're going to have a bunch of DB sets. A DB set is a collection of objects that represent a table in the database. So DB set is a generic type. Let's say DB set of course, and we call it courses. So with this, we can access the courses table in the database. We need 2 more DB sets here for authors and tags. Okay, so our context is ready. Next, we need to specify the connection string. So we go to the application configuration file. Under connection strings, I'm going to create a new connection string. Now here we need to give it a name. If we use the same name as our DB context, we don't need to specify any additional configuration because the Entity Framework can detect connection strings based on convention. But in this case, let me deliberately create a connection string with a different name to show you how to have more control over your connection strings. So let's call this default connection. And here you specify whatever connection string works for your environment. I use SQL Express, so that's my data source. Next, initial catalog, which is the name of the database. I'm going to call it Pluto Code First. And finally, integrated security equals SSPI, which means Windows Authentication. Now, one more attribute of the connection string is provider name. We need to specify that to work with Entity Framework code first. So here we set system.data.sql client. Beautiful. So our connection string is named default connection, which is different from the name of our DB context. So back here, in this case, because we have broken the convention, we need to tell Entity Framework explicitly what the name of connection string is. So here we create a constructor and simply call the base constructor. So note that here we have a few different overloads. I'm going to use the one from the last, which takes a string that determines the name or the connection string. So here we can specify the full connection string, which I don't recommend because it's better to store it in the configuration file. Or we can specify the name of this connection string in the configuration file. So we type name equals, and in this case, it's default connection. Now we need to go to Package Manager console and create a migration. But the first time we need to enable migrations. So we run this command only once in the lifetime of a project. Okay, enabled. Now let's clean this up and add a migration. We give it a name. In this case, we can call it initial model. You can use any names, whatever makes sense to you. Okay, let's take a look at this migration. So under Solution Explorer, you see we have migrations folder, and here's the migration. So you have already seen this before in the demo at the beginning of the course. But let me quickly highlight a few points here. So this create table method here tries to create a table called authors with these columns, ID and name. Note that Entity Framework Code First uses convention over configuration. So these columns you see here, their names, their types, their configuration is based on our model. So Entity Framework assumes when a class has a property called ID, which is an integer, often it's an identity column and it's a primary key. If these conventions do not work for you, you can always change them, as I will show you later in this section. Now let's take a look at another create table method here. Look at this one. So here we create a table called courses with these columns here. We set the ID property as the primary key. And here we have a foreign key to the authors table. And here is the column that is used as the foreign key. So in the courses table, we're going to have a column called author ID, which is a foreign key to the authors table. If you don't like to have this underline in the name of your column, you can always change the convention. That's not a problem at all. And finally, look here, we create an index on the author ID column, because it's quite likely that we may want to look up all the courses by a given author. So all of this is based on the conventions that are built into Entity Framework. Let's take a look at another example here. So our tags table is pretty simple. It has two columns, ID and name. But look at the next one, tag courses. We did not have a class by that name in our model. This is the intermediary table that is used in a many-to-many relationship, because a course can have multiple tags and a tag can be applied to multiple courses. So in this case, Entity Framework knows that we have a many-to-many relationship between courses and tags, so it creates this intermediary table here. Personally, I don't like this name. I think it would be better to call it course tags as opposed to tag courses. But again, we can always change this. And that's a topic for a later lecture in this section. So for now, don't worry about it. Now, one thing I want you to pay attention here is the primary key for this table. Note that here we have an anonymous object with two properties, tag ID and course ID. So the primary key in this table is a composite key. And we have two foreign keys, one to the tags table, the other to the courses table. Note that for both these foreign keys, cascade delete is turned on, which means if we delete a record in the tags table, the related records in this intermediary table will be deleted. Same happens if we delete a record in the courses table. So as you see, Entity Framework is very smart in terms of determining what your database tables should look like based on your model. This way, we can purely focus on the code instead of wasting our time in the table designers, creating relationships, enabling cascade delete, and blah, blah, blah. You know that. So that's the reason I personally love the code first workflow. Okay, with all this, now let's run this migration on the database. So back to the Package Manager console, update database. Beautiful. Let's go to SQL Server Management Studio. Refresh databases. So note that Entity Framework created a new database. And inside this database, we have all these tables. In the next lecture, I will show you how to use the code first workflow with an existing database.